Hello, art students. Welcome to your lesson today with me, Professor William Wright. This is an art appreciation lesson over the chapter 19 of Living with Art by Mark Getlein. Really, it's just the first half or so of that chapter. So let's dig in now. Give me a second to open it up. Okay, so yeah, let me open it up with, chapter 19 is the arts of Asia. This is sort of in our chapters where we get to, go from, studying the ancient world and getting up to Rome through some of the lesser talked about civilization, or what I always say that it's outside of the scope of Western civilization, like some of the stuff that might not have been covered in a lot of art history classes for a while. We're trying to get some of this. And chapter 18 was over Islam and Africa, basically the Middle East and the spread of. We use the spread of Islam as also a kind of a geographical tool. But now we're headed further east and we're getting into Asia, and then chapter 20 is getting even further east in into the Pacific and Americas. In any case, today, we're on chapter 19, and we're going to get about halfway through China. We're going to do India today, and then about half of China, and then part two finishes China and Japan. So let's dig in. And here's a map. I should have had this on a second ago. We started with ancient artworks here in Europe. We got to Mesopotamia, those first civilizations that we often learn about. Then we did the Aegean and Rome, most of the Mediterranean, and then we did Islam and Africa in chapter 18. This is if you're going in order, which actually I skipped several chapters. Chapter 15 finishes up with Rome and gets into the development of Europe, but I like to jump ahead here and then go back to 15 later. But in any case, so we have, whatever order you have it in the class that you're in. We are now headed further east into Asia. We're going to do India, China, and Japan. So starting off, as I said, with India, we're going to discuss basically that India is this sort of subcontinent. It's a rather large peninsula heading out of the western portion of what we call Asia today. Now, there's not like, I'm sure you could draw them, but there's not a hard geographical line between like the Near East, Middle East, if you want to call it that. But the Near East is a better term, headed into further East Asia. And technically, even India itself, as we call it today, is a little bit smaller than the scope of historical India that we're going to talk about. Historical India includes parts of Afghanistan, Pakistan, and some other areas as well. But in any case, in this region, of course, the earliest civilizations arose, like with so many ancient civilizations, around the river, the Indus River, which is, I'm sure, where India gets its name. The first cities arose here around 2600 BC along the Indus River. This Indus River is now really more so like almost this region is almost more so Pakistan than it is northern India. But they're similar and close, and the people of northern India here are closely related to those there because of this ancient connection. But in any case, we're going to start with Indus Valley, Buddhism, Hinduism, and then get into the Mughals, then talk about the arts of India. So the earliest civilization, the earliest town that we know is Mohenjo-daro. Earliest, I guess, city, metropolitan area, is in modern day Pakistan. It's the oldest city in the region that we still know of, right? That we have discovered. So we consider it kind of the earliest civilization there. So they had a sophisticated network of sewers and water supply. I know we covered this with Rome. And like the development of things like asphalt, and then materials called bitumen, which is almost like a cement-like type thing or asphalt type thing. Also cement and stone and adobe. All these things connect back to some of the stuff we've already talked about in ancient art. So I wanted to make sure and bring it up here. And it's also just very interesting that they had a clean water supply as well as sewers to take the dirty water out for their baths and pools there. Also in Mohenjo-daro, we do find some of the earliest artworks. Now, one thing I want to talk about with India now. Let me reiterate with all of this stuff that we're just skipping a stone. Honestly, we're not taking nearly enough time to cover all of this properly in Asia, across Islam and Africa, all this stuff, but we're doing our best. I mean, it's kind of true of all of our history chapters. But in any case, the earliest artworks we have are probably not the oldest ones there were. It's just that they didn't really have, as far as we understand it, those early civilizations didn't have an established caching culture, or basically a system of keeping or storing their artwork. We are limited in what we have found because a lot of it just ended up as trash or was not made in permanent materials. Some of that stuff we talked about in the early parts of the chapters on the ancient world. Although we do have some sandstone figurines that have remained from about 2000 BCE. And again, just in case I haven't covered it before in these chapters, I just want to point out that BC is before Common Era, and then CE is Common Era. But basically, BCE is still BC, and then CE, as we get to it later, is going to mean AD, basically. If I don't say AD and I say CE, just know that they're about the same thing, and BCE is the same as BC. But in any case, yeah, so about 2,000 years before zero, BC. But yeah, the bearded man from Mohenjo-Daro is often compared to some of the early Sumerian sculptural figures that we've seen before, and like kind of the prior ones to those Greek Koros figures. It's kind of pillar-like, very simplified, but with this kind of synonymous pattern on his cloak that becomes well known in the area at this time. But then in addition, outside of Mohenjo-Daro, we do have some artworks from Harappa, which is also in Pakistan, and is more often compared to the red male torsos, more often compared to classical Greek work, but it is more naturalist and not ideal. Greek artwork, as we've already talked about, is tended to be kind of idealized, whereas Indian artwork was more naturalistic, right? More true to life. So it's got the paunch, it's got more like sag and age showing, although it is missing the head and arms. And we're not sure what these sort of nubs on the shoulders and head are for. But in any case, yeah, these are some of the earliest artworks we have in India. And then even like before that / after that, we also, the more common artwork besides those few torsos we have are actually stone seals, which are not artworks in and of themselves, but are tools that were used to create artworks, wax stamps or clay stamps, right? So basically, they're backwards versions, right? Because they're stamps, they are backwards versions of what we would have seen as artworks. But again, those other artworks, they were uncured clay or they were wax, and so they've gone away. But we have the seals left, the stamps that they were using from about 2300 BC in Harappa, from Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro. Once again, the position of the earliest piece in the Mohenjo-Daro stamp here that we see in the top is suggestions of the earliest forms of meditation and breathing techniques from possibly even yoga, as well as the anthropomorphic features of this top figure also are kind of suggestive of the god Shiva, which is even an allusion to the earliest forms of Hinduism and some of the gods there. So yeah, early forms of kind of what's well-known parts of Indian culture today. Now, a couple of things I note as well. First off, like I said, they're relief, but they're cut in because they were supposed to be stamped so that the thing stuck out. But also, if you notice, there are letters and figure characters of some kind. So that is suggestive that there was already, by this time, 2000 BC, in India, there were some forms of writing or a type of cuneiform or something like that, at least figurative or alliterative figures, or characters. In any case, the Ganges Valley is an area where after these earliest civilizations, this is in northern India today, there are some kingdoms. The Emperor Ashoka is the kingdom of the Maurya, or the king of the Maurya, and he, for the first time in history, will unite more of what we know as India today. He goes through, he conquers a lot of the different territories and unites them under one crown to be more like we understand India today. This unification was fairly brutal though, and Ashoka was fairly remorseful, which will lead to his eventual acceptance of Buddhism. And this is sort of a lead up to how Buddhism is created here in the Indian subcontinent. But he accepts it. And then he also, I add these in here as another art nod, that he erected these pillars that would carry edicts that basically declared, that these places, after he conquered them and then felt bad and converted to Buddhism, he named himself as their protector, right? That they were true Indians. They weren't just his subjects or, the people he defeated and he was going to lord over. Although, I'm sure there was to a certain extent, but he promised to protect them and that they were a part part of India. And again, they are united as Indian, regardless of their ethnicity and religion. That's what the edicts apparently say. Here are a couple of the pillars that were erected to carry these edicts, and the lion capital, which was a popular motif for the top of these, the capital being the top of a pillar. These are a lot like the ones that have been seen. These are almost like the Lamassu decorations in Mesopotamia, but they are still representative of India today. In fact, so much so, these lion motifs with also, I'll note, the wheel beneath it, which is a popular Buddhist symbol. But in any case, the lion head, the Maurya dynasty symbol of the lions, is still a part of Indian coinage to this day. Now, what is Buddhism? How can we get into this and talk about how it informs the culture there? So first off, urban centers grew, and an Aryan or previously nomadic society religion spread there from the 8th century. Now, I want to note that Aryan used to be a term for just the people. The term we use now more often is Proto-Indo-European, and they're basically the earliest people who come out of this area in the middle of Eurasia, and basically they're often cited as like spreading and creating all of the languages across Eurasia, from Celtic to Latin to Greek to Indian languages, even Chinese languages. Yeah, there's a big spread there. Essentially, the earliest forms of people, and there are even tribes in India still that call themselves Aryan. Now, where you've probably heard that term before was when it was co-opted by the Nazis and sort of perverted, because they made some connection with, if that's the earliest people, that they were trying to connect Germans to that sort of term. It's not a great connection, and so it ruins that word, but I like to still use it because it's a lot more convenient than Proto-Indo-European people. But also just to inform you that was a misnomer, and that, yeah, these earliest Indo-Europeans did start spreading to India and mixing with the indigenous cultures there of those ancient cities. And by the 8th century BC, we've got a more connected India. In this, more connected to the world outside of it in the first millennium BC. Now, in this time, there was a royal family, and one of the princes was named Gautama. He was born in 563 BC, and after a series of encounters and experiences that led to nothing, basically, he was trying to find the meaning of life, and what his purpose was is sort of the idea. And eventually he decided to stop wandering and just kind of give in to sitting and thinking, right? And meditating on things. And while he sat and meditated under a tree, he became the Buddha, or awakened, which is what the word Buddha means, to the cycle of life, death, and rebirth, and rose above it. Buddhism rose throughout India, and he was laid to rest in the famous Great Stupa, made of 8 memorial mounds. And then this is a real character that lived, or a real person that lived, and we hear this story passed down through the ages, and people would eventually subscribe to his form of meditation and thinking about being awakened to the world and things like that. And that's why he becomes venerated and becomes this sort of religion. So yeah, here is the Great Stupa where he was laid to rest, and I want to go ahead and point out that it was started in the 3rd century BC, the Great Stupa, much later, pretty long, couple hundred years after the death of Gautama. But it was supposedly to house his ashes, and King Ashoka is actually from the pillars is the guy who started building the stupa here to house part of the ashes. And it started as just like a small little stone pile and became this great big mound by the 1st century BC. The structure became more sculptural, much larger. It's not a hollow sculpture. You can't walk inside of it. It's like the pyramids. It's mostly solid. It just houses the remains of the Buddha. It doesn't have interior spaces, although you can walk around. There's sort of an ambulatory stone railing around the premise for circumambulation, which is just a meditative form of walking, which is what this kind of railing here is supposed to perform as. And there are sculptures throughout it, but some of the most influential sculptures are, of course, the Torana gateways that are used for entry to visit the Great Stupa. Now, the Toranas here they're at all four cardinal directions, and it just basically means entry gate. And they are filled with relief motifs telling different stories of the Buddha's birth. Let me see. Common motifs include elephants who represent Buddha's birth, along with other animals, wheels and spirals, and various stories from the life of the Buddha. And actually, there's stories from before he was the Buddha, when he was just Gautama, and after he becomes the Buddha. Most of these were commissioned by locals, and they slowly filled it up. This wasn't all done at once. It was little commissions where a person would, in order to show their veneration, would add little extra decorations and things. There are yakshi figures, elephants, animals, little decorative pillars. Yeah, here's the story of Buddha's mother dreaming of his birth, and you can see the elephant appearing to her in the dream, and supposedly all this sort of story of his birth. The symbols of Buddha. I will say that Buddha, once enlightened, is most often only shown represented by a wheel, a tree, or a footprint. What I mean by that is, before he became the Buddha, he would often be represented physically as a person, like a portrait. But once he becomes the Buddha, they no longer show him as a human being, and they use more symbols. So the tree, because that's where he, meditated and became the Buddha, a tree becomes a common motif. But there's also the wheel, which is reflective of the wheel of Dharma, which is a Hindu thing. And then, so yeah, different kind of motifs there. But yeah, just kind of representing the circle of life and those sort of ideas. But then there are little parasols, which again are sort of circular, like umbrella type figures. And then my personal favorite are the footprints that represent Buddha. When it's just a set of footprints on a decoration, that is another representation of the Buddha. However, after a couple hundred years of the Great Stupa being around and them using strictly these kind of representative symbols to show the Buddha, we start to see pictorial images of the Buddha appear in Gandhara, Pakistan. The dynasties arose north of India, like the Kushan, which ruled from Kabul in Afghanistan all the way to Islamabad in Pakistan. And in Gandhara, a region under the first reign, that is where we see the first images of the Buddha in the 1st and 2nd century CE. Okay, so again, this is getting into AD. The largest collection of images of the Buddha are still found in these regions of ancient India. We see here a gray schist image of the Buddha. Now, all of these, and we talked about it before in class, these positions of the hand, the particular pose, the hairstyle, what's behind them, all of these things have very specific iconography, which reflect different virtues or traits, or just regional preferences in the Buddha sculptures. Also, side note, it's around the same time we start seeing the first images of Christ and more ancient figures as well. Obviously, it's a couple hundred years before Muhammad, so not much. And there are no pictorial images of Muhammad. But in any case, or they're not supposed to be. But in any case, styles of representation continue to develop. There are different eras in Indian kingdoms have their different ways of showing the Buddha. And also, I wanted to be noted that a big difference between some of the images of the Buddha is that they're not all supposed to be the Buddha. Some of them are figures called bodhisattva, which are Buddhist teachers or leaders, basically Buddhist priests that are, they start to become a staple of the next millennia, showing the Buddha or the bodhisattva. They range in qualities. Most carry similar iconography around the pose, the hand gestures, the posture, the clothing, hairstyle, all that kind of stuff. The color, is it relief or is it painted? What are their headdresses? What are their clothes like? Yeah, everything is sort of different depending on the region, the kingdom, the time frame, all that stuff. Some of the most dominant styles came from the Gupta period, sometimes called the Golden Age of India. And see here, this is this is to show you a Bodhisattva, Padmapani from Ajanta, India, Ajanta. I don't know if that's how do you pronounce that exactly, but then Sarnath, India has this image of the Buddha. Again, very different hand pose, head pose, all that sort of stuff. But I wanted to mainly note that while a lot of these most dominant styles of showing the Buddha come from Gupta, I did want to point out that the Gupta were actually Hindu, which is a callback to something we talked about earlier. Hinduism was actually the chosen belief of the Gupta rulers who supported the making of Buddhist art. And they began showing some of the earliest works of the Hindu canon. This was as well as the Buddha and the Christ being shown in the 1st and 2nd century CE. We also started to see the first images of Hindu figures and gods kind of return, right? We'd already kind of maybe seen allusions to it earlier, but we start seeing, figures from the Hindu canon of images that are familiar to us that we see in Asia now, like all the way up to today. We start seeing those in the rule of the Gupta dynasty. But they actually, even though they did support Buddhism, they were Hindu. I just wanted to make sure and point out they were supporting Buddhism at the same time as being Hindu. I'm kind of being repetitive here. Blah, blah, blah. It is actually a mixture of many belief systems, Hinduism, and it is centered around mainly three principal deities. I picked three to talk about because apparently there are hundreds or maybe even thousands of different gods and figures in Hinduism. And so I just kind of distilled it down to the three main ones that we're going to talk about, which are Shiva, Devi / Shakti / Durga, which is like kind of a middle character of different names, and then Vishnu. And let's talk about what each of these are. Shiva is, of course, the destroyer. We see her here, or him here, in dancing form. We see the figure, you see the wheel or ring around the figure with kind of flames. And a dancing figure. And there's a couple things I want to note just right off the bat. I usually ask in class after showing all the figures what to note, but I'll go ahead and say it now since it's just a video lecture. The things I always note about the figures is one, an overall sense of androgyny, right? There's not typically an exact, like, is it a male or female? It's sort of a sexless god type thing. Maybe not exactly, but there is an allusion to a little bit of that, as well as multiple arms, which I think is meant to represent their beyond human, beyond natural state, even in figurative form, or when they're put into figure form. So yeah, here we see, this is a bronze Tamil Nadu sculpture of Shiva in dancing form. And then, as Nataraja, a lot of these different figures are just the different main deities in different forms, different characters. But in any case, we also have Devi or Durga or Shakti. So I just was going to go ahead. I'm jumping to the second paragraph here. If Shiva was the destroyer or death, I will point out, okay, so we're looking at, they believe, much like the Buddhists do, in the kind of endless cycle of life, death, birth, life, death, rebirth. And it's a kind of this recurring life cycle. And Shiva is essentially represents the god of death, the god of the destruction, which will then lead to rebirth. But Durga or Shakti, however you want to refer to them, they are Durga was a god of life, not a good of life, a god of life. Typo. Oops. But yeah, sometimes called a power god, because this was a very active god who would be in fights and be standing up for people. Here we see Durga fighting the buffalo demon. This is Durga right here again, multiple arms, kind of androgynous once again. Here fighting this buffalo demon, anthropomorphic figure. Here, and we see this. These kind of images on different things. I just want to take a minute here by showing this. This is the Rathas at Mamallapuram, and these sort of carved temples are carved. They're meant to look like little carriages, but they were just large stones that were carved down into images. You see the kind of the best images of Hindu imagery from the complex at Mamallapuram. These rathas, which are chariots, carriages of the gods, they are carved out of natural living rock, and they have kind of the most common motifs of all of the figures, but I just wanted to highlight Durga here. And we also see them on Mandir, which I'll talk about in a second. But yes, and anyway, that was Durga or Shakti or Devi. And now we're onto the Vishnu, who is sort of seen as the creator, but also at times the protector of the world. They're the creator of the universe. Vishnu dreamt the world into existence. We see them here again dreaming of all the gods and all the people who are going to be born and live. And then here we see Vishnu as the Boar Varaha, protecting the earth, again carved into stone, which would have been much like what you would have seen on the Rathas at Mamallapuram. Yes, so yeah, we have Vishnu, Shiva, and Durga. And once again, besides the Rathas, we also would have seen these sort of stories, tales, all the different deities, all the figures, the Yakshi, the different many motifs that we see across Indian culture would also have been carved into the mandir, which were the temples. They were Hindu temples for used as a worship centers, and they were very elaborately carved. I actually got to visit one in London. It was beautiful. Every square inch is carved. It's just a lot to take in, and here are some of the more popular ones across the world, and I'm not going to in any way try to pronounce those. But these are both in India itself, but they are across the world. But in any case, going beyond this growth of Hinduism and Buddhism and this development of culture, as we get into the 15th and 16th century AD or CE, there is a group that comes to India known as the Mughals, which were basically a group of Persian-influenced Mongols who had invaded Persia and the Middle East and then adopted Islam and settled there, and then kind of moved out and settled and actually took over in India. And they created an empire in India that set up an Indian form of Islamic art. Basically, the administration of India under the Mughals was Islamic, but they were actually considered one of the most religiously tolerant, at least for the time, societies in power, because they knew that most of the people were Hindu or Buddhist. If there were some remaining Buddhists, although it has moved east, we'll talk about that later. But yeah, they knew that most of their subjects were not going to be Islamic, so they became very religiously accepting. But in any case, one of the most popular structures in India was actually built by the Mughals, and I'll give you a second to sort of think about what it was. What was it? Oh, it was the Taj Mahal. A lot of people don't realize this was built fairly recently, and it was built by Islamic leaders. And you can actually, if you really think back to the Isfahan, the big blue domes, and the sort of Persian motifs, the large pointed arches with the doorways and all the decoration and all this. It looks very similar to the sort of doors and decoration of the Isfahan Mosque, but also there are minarets. There's bell towers all around this, and so it's sort of modeled after a mosque in and of itself, or the Prophet's palace. But in any case, yeah, that is the Taj Mahal under Mughal. The Mughal rule and have very successful dynasty for a couple hundred years. And actually, yeah, just to bring it up, the Taj Mahal was not built as a mosque. It was not built as a temple. It was built as a burial chamber of Shah Jahan for his wife. And it was built for his wife and him after she died. Mumtaz Mahal was giving birth to their 14th child when she died from complications, which 14 children, that's yeah. In any case, when she died, her husband Shah Jahan promised her that he would never remarry, and then would build the richest mausoleum in history over her grave. And so that's why this chamber gets built. This building gets built in the Taj Mahal. So pretty impressive feat for and a pretty nice gift to your deceased wife. Now, in any case, that wraps up India, gets us pretty close to the modern era when the Mughals were ruling. And so we're going to keep going back, staying kind of focused on ancient art. We're going to look at China. China is, you can see here, it's northeast of India. Nepal is between them, and you can see Pakistan here on the map as well. But this is China as we know it today. Of course, as it starts, it doesn't look like this. But we're actually not going to talk much about the Great Wall. It is here, and it was, of course, built to kind of ward off some attacks from the north that would have potentially come in. Note the terracotta warriors we're going to talk about are right here. Yeah, the Hong Kong is far down here. Shanghai is up kind of in the middle of the eastern coast of China. But in any case, the Yellow River is, of course, where this starts. We're going to talk about it and build up to everything. So yeah, we're going to go through Shang to Qin Confucianism / Taoism, Tang Buddhism, and then talk about landscapes and scholars. We're not going to get through all of this in this video, but yeah, we'll get to the Silk Road. But in any case, Proto-Chinese civilization begins about 5000 BC. I want to reiterate, if I haven't said it before, the word proto just means early or pre. Really is a better word, pre-Chinese civilization. But yeah, it starts originating around the Yellow River, right, which is right here. Right, it cuts across it anyway, it cuts through it. It doesn't cover the whole Yellow River, but yeah, these are some of the earliest cities we see. And the first established dynasty is known as the Shang Dynasty here, and it's much smaller, as you can see, as compared to the full China as we know it today. But the formative years of the Chinese dynasties happen in the Shang Dynasty of the second millennium. So you're talking about 1000 to 2000 BC, or I guess I should say 2000 to 1000 BC. This is China emerging from the Neolithic era, basically that late Stone Age, with elaborate works of jade, lacquer, ivory, precious metals, and bronze. Lots of good stonework. They've already got. They were very good at bronze early. In fact, they buried a ton of bronze with people, which always kind of shows you how good they were, that they could just throw it away by burying it with people and all this stuff. But yeah, this is it's part of their wealth. They begin to trade with the broader world. They begin to have success in these crafts, and we see some of the earliest motifs. This Shang late Shang bronze vessel, this kind of tripod bowl, is indicative of some of the vessels we would have seen there. And then worth noting is this kind of spiraled and kind of repeating motif that you see across many of the figures or of the forms. And then actually so much so that some of these spirals start to create almost faces. You see the small little carved animal faces attached, but really here we want to talk about the Taotie, which are basically animal imagery that include the horns and spiral characteristics of early Shang decorative motifs. Basically, they turn these spiraled and horned figures. This is supposed to, the whole thing is kind of a monstrous face, a dragon face or an animal face here, created by these spirals, with the addition of little like small actual, here's like a sort of panther type face in addition to that. Sorry, I keep clicking ahead. These Taotie were thought to be representing communication with the spirit world through animal guides or animal deities of some sort. So yeah, these bronze vessels, and actually I haven't mentioned it yet, but they also had very good early clay vessels as well, which shouldn't be surprising. The oldest pottery in the world is found in Japan. And so yeah, it makes sense that China would also have this very successful clay work as well in these early stages. But in any case, after the Shang fall, they are defeated around 1050 BC, and it brought about a pretty chaotic rule of the Zhao dynasty, um, which, as I understand it, was not necessarily one dynasty, but a whole mess of kind of back and forth dynasty, kind of feudalism. It was a little bit more of a warring era, but of course, you can look. There are bronze bells that the Zhao make. There are big tombs. I'm thinking of in Japan the tombs. But in any case, But you were actually about to look at a pretty elaborate tomb, so it does transition well here to talk about that. But in any case, yeah, there's still elaborate artwork happening in the Zhao, but it sort of zooms through 800 years. And around 221 BC, so we're still BCE, we're still before zero, the state of Qin was created, uniting all of China under one emperor, Shi Huangdi. Now, I don't know that this is his name or as much as his title. I think it essentially means the emperor of the Qin. And actually, as I understand it too, Qin is where we get the name China. And I know it's Qin, but it's pronounced Qin. But in any case, it did not, the Qin dynasty didn't really live long past the one emperor they had, Shi Huangdi. And yeah, so he creates it in 221 BC. And then before he dies, he commissions probably one of the most important artworks in Chinese history, and that is the Terracotta Army. Shi Huangdi's Terracotta Army. I think it's sometimes called the Lington Army, things like that, but I prefer just Terracotta Army because it is a massive army of I think something like 8 to 10,000 figures, all life size. There's cavalry, there's archers, there's infantry. We haven't even finished excavating some of it because we're kind of waiting until technology gets better to kind of finish up excavating. But yeah, it's just this massive undertaking that he took to basically create soldiers to protect his tomb, is sort of the idea of, quote unquote, protect his tomb, and just be intimidating to burglars and things like that. But yeah, in any case, yeah, these are all fired clay soldiers, which once again shows you the advancement of their ceramics technology. But yeah, probably one of the most influential pieces of Chinese art and done during the Qin Dynasty. But then after Shi Huangdi's death, sorry, I have to take another room. After Shi Huangdi's death in 206 BC, yeah, he only ruled for I think like 16 years or something like that. The Han dynasty begins. The Han is kind of, I think, a lot of times, which this might be a little presumptuous, but as I understand it, Chinese people identify themselves a little bit more with the Han dynasty, even though the name comes from the Qin dynasty, just because China, as we know, it starts to really develop during the Han dynasty. They took over control from the Qin. Golly, I keep doing that. They popularized Confucianism and Taoism under a largely peaceful rule. This, another good clay vessel, highly decorated, the cocoon vase. I think one of these is actually in Fort Worth if you want to go see it. It's one of my favorite clay pieces, but yeah, it's done under the Han. And then what is Confucian? What is this culture that develops? Confucianism is a study basically of the philosopher, the teacher Confucius. He lived much earlier than the Han Dynasty, but he was a teacher, editor, a politician, and philosopher. His belief system was based on those ideas and really focused on the idea of the right relationships to produce social order, respecting family and the older generations, acting in a morally correct way. Remember when we talked about it in the past, there are times where people need to sit down and say, hey, this is how we're supposed to act as human beings. He also taught people to seek education of the individual as well as broad society. That if you educate every individual, then your whole society improves as far as education. This was a big part of Confucianism. And again, yeah, he dies in the 5th century BCE. Though it came to power centuries after his life, the Han Dynasty made his teachings the official state policy. So basically, they bring this idea of public education, respect for family, respect for social order to the forefront in state policy. It was used to establish a largely peaceful and ordered society. And note that the Han were in power all the way through 200 AD, right? So it's about a 400-year dynasty from 206 to a little after 206 BC to a little after 200 AD. But yeah, Confucian ideas dominate artistic themes for several centuries, even after the Han. The Confucian ideas kind of hold true. This is one of our first images of the really beautiful brushwork and animation, kind of mixed with calligraphic work that you see in Chinese art. This is, and basically they would almost use art as like book art or guides or teaching of Confucianism or Taoism or public policy. This is the admonition of the instructress to the ladies of the palace. This is a Tang copy, which we'll get to later, of work attributed to Gu Kaiji, who was a Han kind of philosopher. He would have made the original of this, and this is a copy of it. But we see basically how women are supposed to act at court. There's a whole series of stories, like how to properly talk to the king, how to protect the king. There's one where a boar is attacking the king, and the women are supposed to jump in front of it. It's all pretty entertaining and very interesting. I also like to note, I'll go ahead and say it pretty early on, these little red stamps here were apparently when politicians and public figures would get a chance to see an artwork, they would basically stamp it to say like, hey, I saw that. It would add clout to the picture, right? Because this is not an age where they just had this stuff sitting around, images of it on their phone. They had to actually go find the actual art piece, and so I find that interesting. And yeah, again, we see the calligraphy, we see the early writing already well developed by Confucianism, or by the Han Dynasty, and yeah, it was developed by the time of Confucius as well. But in any case, moving from Confucianism to Taoism, if Confucianism was a philosophy for society, spiritual matters were left to the practice of Tao. Tao means literally the way or the path, and it is centered around the flow of the universe. Taoism forms a concept of the afterlife and immortality, but also some philosophy related to intellectualism and poetry. Basically, that you need to embrace and think on the flow of life, and that's almost like a religion. But it makes sense. It really pairs quite well with education and reflection, and reflection pairs well with educating yourself and becoming kind of improved intellectually. And yeah, being a writer, being an artist. Here we see an incense burner from Liu Shang's tomb in Han, China. We would have seen the smoke almost like, those dinky little Walmart incense burners where the holes, the smoke comes out of it. The smoke would have come out here and reflected the sort of waving, beautiful, asymmetrical, curvy lines of the incense burner itself. Very interesting. And then actually, this is my last slide for this video. The Han, their last biggest contribution besides really developing Confucianism and Taoism is also the creation of, not the creation of, the full realization of the Silk Road is what I should say. It was the Han Dynasty emissaries attributed with the major expansion of the famous trade routes that formed the Silk Road. These routes connect east to west in the trade of goods, which includes silk, pottery, bronze, all that good stuff we already talked about, as well as religion and philosophies, which we're going to talk about in a minute, a little bit later, as well as science, technology, and of course diseases that spread and create all kinds of problems in the ancient world. But you can see here the routes that go from China. They start in China. They go through the north of the Himalayas. This was a very important trade route right here. This area, Transoxiana, north of Persia, is a big part of why Persia becomes so rich. It's a big part of the steppe peoples, the Mongols, and the various steppe peoples that are always raiding and moving across. They're always moving through these very rich areas. And in any case, then the physical, the dirt routes, I guess I should say, the land routes, take you to the Mediterranean Sea, and then the Mediterranean Sea takes goods all the way into Western Europe from China. But also, what a lot of people don't realize is how elaborate the sea routes across the coast of Eurasia were in the Silk Road as well. So it's not just a road, it's a silk way, a silk sea road as well. But in any case, yeah, that's a good place for us to stop. I do want to note that in case it gets confusing later, the Han dynasties open up the trade route. They are really responsible for the Silk Road. But later, in terms of spreading philosophy and religion, I did want to point out Buddhism will spread across the Silk Road, but it's not until a later dynasty that makes it official policy. So take note of that. Even if it spreads across the route that the Han developed, that's not the whole story. But in any case, that's a little teaser for next time. I hope you enjoyed today's video. And yeah, it's a little bit longer than I wanted to go, but I think it's still not too bad. So in any case, I hope you enjoyed that first half of chapter 19. Look for the second part to be available to you soon. Thanks.